For over a century and a half, Milwaukee's only known lynching victim, George Marshall Clark, lay in an unmarked grave in Forest Home Cemetery. Clark, who was black, was killed in September of 1861 after being accused of a crime he did not commit. Last week, a headstone was finally placed at his grave. WUWM's Audrey Nowakowski has the story.
On September 6, 1861, 24-year-old George Marshall Clark and another black man, James Shelton, were arrested after an altercation with two white men. The fight ended after Shelton injured the men with a knife. One of the men identified Shelton as his assailant before he died the next day. A white mob stormed the city jail soon after. And as Shelton hid, Clark was abducted and lynched in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward on September 8th. After his body was cut down, he was taken to Forest Home Cemetery and buried in an unmarked grave in a public lot. 160 years later, the burial site finally has a proper headstone, thanks to the efforts of a local artist and activist, Tyrone Randall Jr., and Forest Home Cemetery.
It kind of stirs me a little bit just to see this many bodies out here that care about the education behind this.
Randall first researched George Marshall Clark in the summer of 2020, along with his partner Adiah Winter, when they were planning on a march to the gravesite. However, when they discovered Clark's grave was unmarked, it became Randall's mission to raise the funds needed to memorialize Clark with a headstone.
It's easy to just act like something doesn't exist if you can't see it. So the fact that it's tangible, like, hey, that's actually there, that actually happened, I can go and I can say, like, that's a body in the ground, and that, I think people need to be able to see that.
Forest Home Cemetery and America's Black Holocaust Museum held a ceremony to unveil Clark's headstone last week. Community leaders, historians, and activists were among those gathered in the cemetery's Victorian garden on a clear afternoon, surrounded by countless trees and headstones large and small. Educator and public historian Reggie Jackson spoke.
So often we think of lynching victims as just that, as that moment in their life, as if they had never done anything prior to that moment. We forget who they were before that. Let's think of what we're doing for George Marshall Clark tonight, not being a celebration of the fact that we're acknowledging this lynching, but that we're celebrating his life that was ended by that lynching.
When Wisconsin became a state, most black Americans were enslaved, and the legacy of that injustice still persists, says Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley.
When my grandfather was born, most black Americans lived as second-class citizens. Even today, as my wife and I raise 3 children, brutal police violence, racial segregation, disparate health outcomes, they all plague our community. But despite all these odds, we have never lost hope that Milwaukee can be a great place for us all to live, work, as well as raise our families.
Pardeep Singh Kalika of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee called for justice and healing, and for people to reflect on the ways they perpetuate racial injustice.
It is well understood that our country has its roots in racialized, religious, and ethnic violence. Our foundational dirt is so soiled and bloodshed that it's a wonder that grass still grows and trees still blossom. But they do, and so do black families. So does black love, and so does black brilliance. But that does not mean that we can ignore black pain, nor be absolved of our own responsibility in causing it.
After remarks concluded, participants walked to Section 17 of the cemetery to gather around Clark's gravesite. Tyrone Randall stood behind the headstone, which was covered in an emerald cloth.
Emotional. I'm happy that this has come to a conclusion for Marshall. And the work's not done, y'all.
The cloth was pulled away, showing a black granite headstone that reads, George Marshall Clark, July 1st, 1837, September 8th, 1861. Dedicated on September 8th, 2021. Lest we forget.
Want to grab them?
The marker was blessed, and each person at the ceremony laid a flower at the headstone, finally paying respect to a man's life taken.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring.
Audrey Nowakowski, 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.